Welcome everyone to this panel which Women's Voices Australia has organised. Thank you for coming. I acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past, present and any Aboriginal people who are here in the audience tonight. I also welcome and acknowledge particularly the support of David Limbrick, who's been very helpful in attempting to organise tonight's events. Bev MacArthur, who's also been a great supporter in Parliament. Helen Joyce, our wonderful international speaker. And, of course, all of you who have dared to come out to fight what may have been protesting hordes out the front. You never know when you're coming to one of these sorts of events. So thanks to everyone for coming, for your interest and dedication despite the threats to sense and sensibility. Tonight we will have David speaking to us first about the law and transformation of Victorian law, followed by a keynote speak from Helen, and then I will introduce our panellists and there'll be a moderated panel discussion with time for questions at the end, about 30 minutes for questions, not comments. Toilets, Jasmine, are behind us. Emergency exit.
Also out the back.
But we expect no emergencies tonight. And without further ado, I pass it over to David Limbrick.
Thank you so much, Nia. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is David Limbrick. I'm from the Libertarian Party. I'm a Member of Parliament with Bev. Laws in Victoria. Well, before I got elected to Parliament for the first time back in 2018, I wasn't really engaged in this policy area at all. I didn't really know much about it. In fact, I probably had a similar level of knowledge to it as pretty much anyone in the general population. And there's been three real key things that have gone through Parliament and with increased intensity and interest from both myself and the wider libertarian movement and others. The first one was in 2019, like right after I got elected, which was around birth certificates. And what that means is that in Victoria now, anyone can basically change the sex on their birth certificate to pretty much whatever you want, as long as you get a letter from someone saying that it's true. And then in 2021, a bill which I thought was rather curious at the time was the Change in Suppression Conversion Practices Bill. And it was sold as something which it really wasn't. And it was sold as something which was meant to stop gay conversion therapy, which is a horrific practice which I oppose and which I think most people oppose. And it did that, it actually did that. But it also did something else, and it did this thing which alarmed both myself and my team when we started looking at it, and it enforced this thing called affirmation only approach in law, which we weren't familiar with, but when we looked at it, we saw that it was overriding the rights of parents and free people, and we decided that we needed to oppose it because it was essentially a restriction on freedom of association, freedom of belief, and these are things that libertarians care about. And we decided to oppose it. And that turned out to be a lot more difficult than what I thought, as many of you here would be aware, in that you attract a large amount of criticism, people call you names and things like this. But, and I know that Bev MacArthur actually attracted a lot more criticism and paid a far greater price than I did, because Bev actually voted against it even though her own party didn't. And that's a big thing. It takes a lot of bravery to do that. And so we campaigned against it, we fought against it. And I have a totally clear conscience in that, because actually what we were concerned about was this pathway of what we have with children, especially with this transition pathway of social transition through to medical transition, and there's no way out. And it's already had an effect. I've spoken to therapists when they get children who say that they are suffering some sort of gender distress. They don't want to deal with it and they refer them on. And I think that this is a terrible thing that's happened in Victoria and it needs to be overturned. The next thing that's happened, which is, as the bill has passed, but it's yet to come into law at the moment, was this, what the government was calling the social cohesion laws. And as with everything, they have good motives behind some of these things, but there was two components of it, and basically it's about stopping vilification, but it's also about stopping people saying things and referring to things in certain ways. And there's two components of these laws. Firstly, there's the criminal components. The criminal components are for very severe vilification. Those laws have actually already gone into effect. They're in force. That was actually not the part of the bill that concerned me the most. The part that concerned me the most is the civil part, which is going to be mediated by the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. And I had my first run-in with them during the pandemic, and I haven't been impressed ever since. But as you can tell, that's coming into effect next year, and I have very serious concerns about the chilling effect that might have on both places of work, general discourse about these sorts of things, the sorts of things that you people are interested in. But I'll say this. I'll finish on an optimistic note. Things are very different in 2025 in Victoria than they were in 2021. You might have noticed that there is a lot more media willingness to report on this issue, especially from the Australian. I know that they've been absolutely fantastic. In fact, I got a call today from a journalist that's printing another story tomorrow. With children, gender ideology for children made front page news. When last week in Parliament, when I brought up males being in women's prisons, that made the front page of the Oz. They've been very, very good at reporting on this stuff and deserve a lot of credit, really, because it took a lot of bravery. But we've also had success in getting the Spotlight documentary out in 2023. Gavin, one of my staff, I can't see him at the moment, but he had a lot to do with getting that over the line and getting those stories out into the mainstream. But ultimately, what I think needs to happen is we have a captured political class, and the way to beat that, I think, is to get everyday people, mums and dads, and that's what I've been focusing on, to understand these issues. Because when this ideology rubs up against the reality of meeting normal people, it falls apart. It totally falls apart. And I think that that's what needs to happen. Next year, we have an election in Victoria, and I would urge everyone in this room to get the positions from people who are wanting to be members of Parliament and what they think about this and what are they going to do about it, because what's happening at the moment is untenable. We need to fight back against it, and it's going to be the people, like the people in this room, that are going to be doing that work to push back against it. All I can do is support it and do what I can to fight it and get it in the media and get a platform for it, but ultimately it needs mass support, and that needs people power. So, thank you.
Thanks, David. Okay, our next speaker is Helen Joyce. She needs no introduction, but I will nevertheless give a short introduction. Helen is the author of Trans. What's the full title?
Well, there's two different ones.
When Ideology Meets Reality. It was funny that you said that. It was the original one, but they've reissued it as Gender Identity and a New Battle for Women's Rights.
Thank you. I was just looking at my notes and I was like, I thought it was, yeah. So 2021 Book of the Year, The Times, Observer and The Spectator. Helen is also a Director of Advocacy at Sex Matters, one of the UK-based NGOs, which has been so important over there since 2022. And she has demonstrated how to persuasively push back against gender identity ideology with reference to pearls like Orwell's bang on the money quote that Helen applied to those who pretend to not know what biological men and women are. dumb ideas that are so stupid only intellectuals believe them. Sex Matters intervened in the Four Women Scotland case, where the Scotland High Court gave a sensible definition of the word woman. And I think that will be of particular interest to the lawyers in the crowd tonight and people generally, where we have our own legal cases here with some brave lesbians intervening in other important cases and so on, about how we can use that kind of advocacy to hopefully get the kind of change that we need. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you. I'm going to reselect myself and put my phone with my notes on it. So I was asked to speak about the highs and the lows of campaigning for women's sex-based rights. So I thought I'd take that in two different meanings. One is like very personally, what have been the highs and lows, like what's been happy and what's been sad, and the other one is, in terms of the outcomes or the processes. So the bits, the high points of the journey that we've taken so far in the last several years in the UK. And so I thought I'd start by talking about how I got interested in the subject in the first place. I think very like David, we were just talking there now, he came out of a finance background, he didn't go into politics to think about this issue. Who goes into politics to think about who's a man and who's a woman? Apparently some people do, but all the wrong ones. They think the wrong thing, So I was at The Economist. I joined there in 2005, and I wrote about sensible things like education, and I moved out to Brazil to be a foreign correspondent, and then I came back and I edited a section of the paper that was called the International section. So that each week did a long read on something very random and different that couldn't fit in any of the thematic sections or geographical sections of the paper. And on one fateful day in 2017, the editor of the paper sat down beside me and said, have you heard this thing that the kids keep coming home and saying such and such is trans? I said, no, never heard of it. Haven't heard of that, haven't heard of Judith Butler, not heard of basically any of it. So I said, I'll find an author. And I'll skip past the bit where I tried to find an author and found people who had read Judith Butler. And, became sort of over several months convinced that if anyone was going to write this sensibly, I'd have to write it. And I did. And in the process of that, I found some quite surprising things because, by that point I'd been at The Economist for 10 years and I had written about a lot of different things. I lived in a developing country, I'd written about political corruption, I'd interviewed, very bad people as well as very good people and very difficult topics. And I was used to phoning people and saying, hi, I'm from The Economist, I'm writing an article about such and such, and maybe I use the wrong language in some way. And then someone would say to me, oh no, we don't say that anymore, or did you think about, I can remember saying to somebody when I was writing an article about adoption, I said something about somebody's real parents. And the woman just politely said to me, and I feel like I'm his real mother. I thought, God, yeah, that makes total sense. That's what I was used to. If I got something wrong, someone would just correct me. And so I dropped a note to Stonewall, which I thought was quite a good charity, I admire people who set it up and so on, and I said, I'm very interested in this thing you say, trans women are women, and doesn't that mean that we're going to have to let men into women's spaces? And they sent me an extremely rude email back and said they wouldn't talk to me and blocked me on Twitter. That was my second ever block on Twitter. My first ever was Helen Joyce. So unexpected. I'm sure we've all had this experience. You think that you're an ordinary person with ordinary opinions in mainstream society, and suddenly you're being treated like you're saying something about lizard people. And what you're saying is, if men can say they're women, men can come into women's spaces, and then they won't only be women. Lizards. The lizards are walking among us, apparently. But anyway, I ended up writing this article, and for me, everybody has their own story of how they get into it, don't they? Not just their peaking moment, everyone has their peaking moment, but everyone has their thing. For a lot of people it's kids, and for a lot of people it's sport, and then for probably quite a few people here it's women's rights. And for me it was, sort of more idiosyncratic, which is I don't like circular definitions. Because before I was a journalist, I was a mathematician. And a circular definition is a definition where you use the word you're trying to define in the definition. So, what is a woman? A woman is anyone who says she's a woman. And that, if you put a random sound instead of woman in there, if you say like blurg, what is a blurg? A blurg is anyone who says they're a blurg. What's a blurg? You've given no information. So, I spent 11 years being a mathematician. I did a first degree, master's, PhD, and 2 postdocs. And that 11 years gave me confidence to say, that's a circular definition. So it wasn't entirely wasted. It also gave me the arrogance to think that, I'm not that stupid. So if I'm disagreeing with this, maybe it's not me that's wrong. So I wrote this article, and I would say it was like 80% successful. I look back at it, I don't think it was great, because I still couldn't believe. I thought I must be missing something. People that I liked, people that I approved of, organisations that I thought were good, were on the other side on this, when they were on the same side as me on everything else. And it's very discombobulating. I'm sure we've all had that experience. So I think I kept leaning too much the wrong way. I think we all do that when we start talking about it first. We give too much away. Like, of course we use there's nothing, toilets aren't important. What I'm worried about is X, And then I couldn't leave it alone though. It was too strange, just too strange, and it kept nagging away at me. And then I changed jobs at The Economist. I was the finance editor, so I spent my days thinking about bond markets and the next president of the European Central Bank and so on. But it was still bothering me. And every now and then I'd come in. I remember one morning coming in on a Wednesday, and there are very busy days at The Economist, the day that you get most of the paper together because we go to press Thursday morning. And I went and found my boss, who ran the back half of the paper and was a good friend of mine and very supportive. And I said to him, "You're not going to believe it. They really, really, really think men can be lesbians." And he went, "Nah, fuck, you're joking." like everybody, I do think one of the reasons that this has gone so far is because it is so mad. If it was like 1% as mad, people would notice it was mad. So insane, they think that you're insane.
Yes.
They think that you've got it wrong. Like, no, Helen must just been Swedish. Nobody could possibly think that. It can't be happening.
Yeah.
I mean, to sort of, pull a story from a bit further along, when my book was in the process of being written, and my husband tried to explain to his parents what it was about. One of them said to him, I think it was his mother said to him, "This can't be happening, because if it was, it will be on the BBC." Yeah, which sums it all up really, doesn't it? So yes, I think it was the middle of 2019 I got really seriously disturbed by it, because I'd started to feel, that weird sense of unreality where you're, I think it's those things like people say you go down the rabbit hole, or you're in the upside down, or whatever. You look around and things look fake, because this thing is so strange. And yet people are saying it, people that you think are sensible and other things, and you start to get a kind of weird feeling that maybe there are lizard people. No, I'm not, that's not the next book. And then I was invited to, so I went to a walk on my own. I read this article about an ancient road in Ireland that one of the saints, Declan, had walked on to meet St Patrick. And the landowners along this walk had reopened all the byways, and you could do it. You didn't walk yourself. So I decided I'd do this on my own, and I would just think. So I walked for 120 kilometres, 20 kilometres a day, and just stayed in random places on the way, and thought, I'm going to have to write about this. I remember reading the books I read on the way. I read The Man Who Would Be Queen, in the evenings. And then that autumn I was invited to an event for detransitioners. And I'd never met a detransitioner at this point. I knew what the word was being used for. But there were 6 young women who had been brought together in Manchester, and they sat there and they told us what they had been told, why they had done what they had done. One of them was a sister, so she hadn't medicalised. One of them had had all her sex organs removed, including her uterus and ovaries, and she's only 23. That had happened at 21. And then the ones in between had taken testosterone and had mastectomies. And I sat there and I thought, you can't call yourself a journalist and not write about this. Because it was just a turning point. Like, it's news, nobody's covering it. You don't run away from the news, you run towards the news. That's kind of the definition. Shit is happening, turn up with your notebook, write it down, do your best, move on to the next story. And I sat there and I thought, I've got to try and tell this story. So it was in Manchester, and I stayed over that night, and at the time my older boy was at university in London, and where I live I had to go back via London. And I didn't sleep that night. I was thinking how terrible this is, how awful it is. I'm so sorry for these kids, I'm so sorry for their parents. Like, I was really working myself up, you know. And my son wasn't having a great year in his first year at university. And he rang me in the morning and he said, are you coming back via London? Can we meet for lunch? I'm not feeling great. And this stab of pain, like the mother's stab of pain, like, oh, my child is not feeling well. And I realised how much worse I felt about that than I had felt about listening to these 6 kids. And it just reminded me that, you know, yes, it's my job to do this, and yes, I really do care, and I did blow up my life in order to write about these kids. But let's not pretend that what I feel is what the people who are inside this feel. You know, I always remember that when people say, you know, how do you cope with it? How do you cope with the abuse? Isn't it hard? No, my house is fine. It's the people, it's inside their house. I mean, and there are some of them, I'm sure, in this room, I know there are. And that's one of the reasons why we do it. Inside your house, and if it's your child is the priority. And that's correct. You don't say things that make things worse in your own house. So those of us who don't have it inside the house have to talk about it for those who can. So I always remember back to that feeling of like, my child is having a bad day, this kid was sterilised by crazy doctors. And I remember that, you know, my child bothered me more. But my work is the other one. I hope that makes sense. It seemed a meaningful thing to me at the time, and still. So I decided I'd write a book, and I didn't think I'd get a publisher. I didn't think I would get an agent. I did actually get both. The first agent who said yes to me, she was so excited about it. Kept saying it's going to be really controversial. She said, yeah, I love controversial. So excited. You could see her just thinking like extra you know. And then I sent her the book proposal, and I think it was either on International Women's Day or the day after International Women's Day in 2020. I knew she wasn't going to take it because she'd been for several days answering me. She sent me the I just feel more comfortable on the fence. And she said, I'm sorry, I feel like a coward.
Yes.
And I was at an event actually talking to other people about gender things, and I sat there and I just thought, that is because you are. But I didn't like that. I just said, okay, thank you for letting me know. And then I thought I would set up my own publishing company, because that's actually very easy these days, and my husband's a proofreader, so I'd get him to proofread it. I thought I'd call it Burning Books. Press, I was kind of sorry I didn't set up a little press called Burning Books, that would have been fun. But in fact, Kathleen Stock got on to me and said, look, ask my agent. And that was a real act of sisterhood and kindness from her, because it's not usual for agents to take 2 books that are very similar. Because it's just hard for them, they're conflicted, they're trying to sell 2 different books, you know, to the same people. So Caroline said, really, are you sure? And Kathleen said, yes, do it, you know, take the book, it's fine, I'm fine with it. So thank you, Kathleen, that was really kind. And then Kathleen found a publisher, and I got a publisher, and it all went fine. So, high points and low points. Writing a book is a low point, as I knew it would be. I know Holly's here, is there anyone else who's written a book here? Fucking nightmare. Always swore I'd never write a book. Many of my colleagues at The Economist wrote books, and it's always this bit like where, you know, your deadline's coming, you're miserable, you can't do it, and you wonder why you ever said you did anything so stupid. And so yes, it was like that. I was in Ireland doing it. I took a few months unpaid leave and stayed with my parents, neither of whom had good health, and I wrote as much as I could then. And then I went back to work, and I did 6 to 9 a.m. every day and all day weekends while I was editing the finance section and doing other things, and it was tough bloody going. But then it was done. And what I had planned while I was writing the book, like the reason I did it was because it was driving me mad. And I felt that if I can write it down and it makes sense to me logically, like I don't mean the ideology, that doesn't make sense, but I can, to my own satisfaction, write it all down and feel that's that done, I've pinned it to the page. But I could then put that aside and go back to my ordinary life. That was the plan. It turned out not to be the case. Because it turns out that when you say something is done as men can be women and women can be men, it really breaks everything. And it breaks things a bit at a time, like it ripples out from where it starts, and it's still rippling out. There's this expression I keep thinking of, William Burroughs, the sci-fi author, the dystopian sci-fi author, he said, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think that's really true of both good and bad things. There are places and there are people who think it's obvious that men can be women and women can be men. And there's bits of the law where that's true. But there's still plenty of places where it's not true at all. Most people don't know it, most people don't think it, lots of laws are still not broken, but they're falling. It's rippling out. The future is spreading out from the bits where it's already here. And just every day, people were asking me things, people were telling me their stories, parents were getting in touch. But mostly what I was finding was that I didn't want to be doing my job. I wanted to be thinking about this still, it was too interesting. And The Economist was very good to me, they didn't fire me, and they supported me, they promoted me in fact, and I was editing the Britain section by this time. And that was the job I would have loved when I started in 2005. So it's really important that the editor did support me, like she hosted my book launch, invited people to The Economist's offices for this book. So I would never hear a word against it, but the fact was I wasn't doing what I knew I should be doing. And later on I discovered an expression that I hadn't known, which is when you experience a moral injury or a psychic injury. And it sounds odd to say that I was experiencing that when I was doing a great job for a great organisation, who were supportive to me. But the fact is I knew I wasn't doing what I should be doing. And that's the central thing of experiencing a moral injury at work, when you know what you should be doing but you cannot do it. And it's more usual that it's somebody who's in a workplace that has got all turned upside down. That wasn't me, I was just in the wrong place. So if you're, the person who told it to me, this expression, she was working in probation, and there was just too few probation officers, too much work, and they were having to do very, very hard risk assessment. So every experienced probation officer was working with men, because it's always going to be more risky. But she had trained to work with women. And the women are the hardest people in probation, actually. They're the people who need the most support, but they never go out and do mass shooting sprees and kill people. So she was working, she had 300 women on her caseload, and they were all of them in a bad way. And she said, that's you experience a moral injury because you can't do what you know you should be doing. And it makes you sick. And then you, of course, go off sick, and things get worse. So I started to have quite strong stomach pains, like really every day, because I wasn't doing what I knew I should be doing. And it was hard to make the decision to leave a job that I loved in a place I still love. But, I didn't spend the rest of my life with stomach pains. So I did. I took a year's leave of absence, and I went and worked for Sex Matters for that year. Again, I'm very grateful to The Economist for giving me that year's leave of absence option, because otherwise I just don't think I could have had the courage to do it. But I didn't go back, I stayed with Sex Matters, and I no longer have any stomach pains. They stopped like that, so it was definitely the right decision. So I would say, mostly it's been very positive things. It's been extremely interesting. I've met a lot of very interesting people through it. It's been very intellectually stimulating. So what have the lows of it been personally? A lot of it's just very sad. Like, the world's full of really sad things happening that we can't stop. I mean, there's famines and earthquakes and, diseases that kill people and so on. And could we have picked a more fantastically stupid thing to waste our time on as a society than this? I actually just literally can't think of anything dumber. And it's so harmful, and it's harming so many people, and people that I feel strongly that I care for, in particular gender non-conforming kids. So if I allow myself to look at that, it feels just overwhelming that humanity doesn't even deserve to live. Like, you want to go where's the comet? This is so dumb. And so I don't tend to look directly at that very often. I think another thing is just how much faith I've lost in institutions and in people. Like, I used to fundamentally think most people were pretty sensible. And I kind of still do. But not the ones who are running stuff. Yeah. I just don't get it. They're either cowards or they're stupid or both. And I used to have more faith in democracy as a way to, work things out. I still do. I still hope that we can get there. I used to work. I worked for an organisation that placed a great deal of faith in the idea of institutionalising, that you could have a young government in a country like Brazil, where I worked as a foreign correspondent, and institutions would become stronger, and that's what those of us in the developed world could do. But look at our institutions. It turns out that there's termites right through the entire edifice of our liberal democracy, and that is actually extremely scary to me. I think a lot worse of a lot of people than I used to. I don't like that feeling. I'm a cheerful, friendly person who wakes up every day and wants to smile at people and talk to them. It turns out a lot of them are thinking some very strange and stupid things. I mean, I still find it hard to believe that you can say to people, look, if a man can say he's a woman and we have to treat him as a woman, you will end up putting rapists in women's jails. That's just QED. And instead of going, oh my God, that's the most shocking thing, I hadn't thought of that, they say, you're saying all trans women are rapists. It's just so depressing. I really thought that would be the one, and it upset that would get through to people, and it gets through to nobody. And I don't know, do people really not care? Do they not care about vulnerable people? It turns out lots of them don't. I think I've become very coarsened compared with what I used to be. I've just become much more used to people, saying outrageous things, in particular outrageous things about me. I used to live in a world where people said I was genocidal. It's just bizarre. And I mean, I do have a strong sense of the ridiculous, and that's the only thing that keeps me going through this. I do think it's funny a bit as well. Mild-mannered 57-year-old mum of two heading off for a bit of genociding. It's just but at the same time, it's actually a bit shit that I've got used to these things. I used to be somebody that people took seriously, and now I'm expected to sit on a stage with a clown like Frida Wallace. It's like, and I've stopped noticing in a way. It's only when I step back and look, how did that happen? And then the nastiest thing I think that happens is, when things go wrong, if I say something wrong or I do something wrong, of course every little thing I say and do is just looked at with a microscope and given the most uncharitable possible interpretation. And you look back and you think, oh, I wish I had said that differently, I wish I had written that differently, I wish I'd phrased that differently. And then you feel ashamed. You feel ashamed of yourself, but also mostly you feel ashamed of the other people that you've let down. Because you're causing trouble for people you care about. You feel you've brought trouble inside the organisation, maybe trouble inside your family, and I think I've learned that feeling of shame is the most corrosive feeling. All of us want to feel like we're good people, that we are fine, upstanding moral citizens, and that we are doing the right thing. And of course, sometimes we're not, and we should be able to accept that and apologise and do better and so on. But I think the reason is because shame is so painful. So that has been very difficult. Personally, accepting that, any flaw I have is magnified and picked over and looked at. And the way I deal with it is I just block and mute and try not to see it and so on. And I have the great privilege of being such a well-known TERF that nobody ever talks to me unless they agree with me. More or less, So I think it's actually much harder for the people who are still in organisations where they're surrounded by the lizard people. I'm joking, they're surrounded by fine and upstanding gender identity ideologies. Because they have to cope with that, and I don't anymore. I hated it. I hated being someone that I knew that there were people around me thinking that I was a bad person for what I believed. It's much easier to be away from, frankly. What else? So, okay, good things. Camaraderie. It's a great bunch of people. There's blitzed spirit. I'm sure you have the same. We call it GC Inc. in the UK. GC Inc. is a fine bunch of people. They fight like cats in a sack, and you can't hurt them. Fine bunch of people, one and all. So that's great, and that people I wouldn't have known. It's it's amazing to have a chance to reinvent yourself in your 50s. Like, I love The Economist, and I would have stayed there, and I intended to stay there until I retired, and I expected that I'd be moving jobs, which is a privilege as well, to be able to change jobs in the same organisation. But this is just a new departure, like it's kind of, not many people get to do it at my age. It's nice to feel that you're doing something you're good at. I really feel that being Irish, you really learn to talk. I wish there was an Olympics in talking, because we were going to take it, and there wouldn't be any ageing out of it either, and I could compete. So it's nice to be able to use my superpower of just fluently and cheerfully talking endlessly to do something good. But also just the things that I've done in my life, like I've had an odd career. I trained as a dancer, and then I went and did mathematics. The dancing hasn't helped any, but there you go. And the mathematics, and then the public understanding of maths and science, and then journalism has actually been extremely helpful. So I don't just bring an ability to speak fluently and endlessly. I also just bring the experience of having to write for a large and global, understanding what works in the news, understanding how you craft a message, and because I like teaching a lot, so I do media training for GC Inc. It's just great to be doing something that I know that I'm offering something that's different and that's special. So that's the sort of the ups and downs personally, and probably a lot of it is actually the what happens in the world as well at the same time. But just to sort of talk about that, it's mostly been up in the UK. And that's one of the reasons I'm cheerful, is that we're winning a lot, and gosh, it feels nice. I think isn't it that, I don't know if it's a real quote from Genghis Khan, that one about enjoying smiting your enemy and grinding his face in the dust. It feels good. But what can you learn if you look at the UK and at the victories in the UK from another place? I suppose would be a good way to frame that. I mean, one thing I've really understood looking back over it is how foundational the free speech thing is. So Maya's case, establishing that, at least in theory, you cannot be fired for saying that you know that sex is real. That's so important, because in every totalitarian regime, I'm not quite there, but we have elements of totalitarian regime on this, the way that they get you to be quiet is to put you in fear of your work. That you can't make money, you can't put bread on the table, or that your family members won't be able to do that. And of course, there's still a great deal of unlawful behaviour towards people in work, but at least there's that fundamental basis that there is legal protection, and we've now won a bunch of cases. So I'd say that's the absolute ground drop that you have to have. You have to be able to talk about it without getting fired. And then the second thing is that point about the way that the future is here but unevenly distributed. That's very true legally. Every country that had established laws still has laws that make sense. They haven't finished breaking all the laws yet. Like even here, like you were the first people to break your Sex Discrimination Act. But you're still signatories to CEDAW, you're still signatories to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and those really do mean sex, primarily between man and woman. And I know that the people in the NGOcracy say they don't, but they do. Those arguments are still there to be made. In organisations and in fields, some bits of medicine are still fine. Like if they haven't been too close to the gender lunacy, like endocrinology is falling, some other bits are falling, but there's bits that aren't. So I think you need to think strategically and think about where is the future, the bad future, not yet arrived, and see if you can jiu-jitsu use those bits of the law and those bits of institutions to kind of push back in on the bits that are broken. I think that's the way I think about Moira Deeming's libel case. Like, John Pizzuto was talking within a system where once a woman says sex is real, you are literally allowed to say anything you like about her. Like, he thought that was the rules of the game, because that is the general rules of the game. She's a literal Nazi. The libel rules don't say that. So suddenly he found himself in a different game. He found himself in a place that has not yet got broken. So we have to think that way. We have to think like, where is still sane? How can we use those bits to push back in and hem in the lunacy? And then thinking about that, so any of you who don't know, I was here in Adelaide on Saturday for a conference, which was really excellent, on gender dysphoria. So That's all going to be put online, and they are going to be signing up people for their emails and so on. I would highly recommend it. Just want to remember to say that. One of the things I talked about in the panel afterwards was a famous essay by Václav Havel, the dissident Czech writer and politician. It's called The Power of the Powerless, and it's available online. You can read the whole thing free. If you're my age and European, the bit of it that you know well is, it starts with this example of a greengrocer who puts up a poster in the window of the shop saying, "Workers of the world, unite." And Havel says, like, why is he doing that? He doesn't give a shit about workers of the world, you know? And the reason is he doesn't want his windows smashed. You put this up, you know, what's the cost? They're just pronouns, you know, you say the words and they leave you alone. And that's interesting enough, and it was the bit that I already knew, but there's actually a second bit to the essay where he talks about working within corrupt systems. And he says, why is it that the dissidents in the Soviet and you know, post-Soviet countries keep turning to the law when the law is so corrupt? So if you look at the law in Czechoslovakia, the law is excellent, it's all lovely, but they're not following it. They go through the fake trials, you know, they imprison people, they've done it all, but it was all corrupted, and yet we appeal to the law, he said. Why do we do that? And he said, because the other alternative is to be a revolutionary and to smash things, but also you do actually get somewhere by using the law, by using the system. You put them to the point of having to prove what they're doing. You highlight the difference between what they say they're doing and what they're actually doing. You make them have to try harder to justify the wrong things that they're doing. And I think that's a good metaphor for how we have to talk about gender medicine, how we have to talk about these laws that have got corrupted. You know, yes, we can't just say, oh, you know, blow up the Equality and Human Rights Commissioner. You know, they've gone completely AWOL.
First.
Well, no, we have to use their words against them. We have to say, you say human rights are universal. Look what it says in CEDAW. We have to do it. We have to do it that way. We may have to blow them up down the line, but we've still got time to, you know, to use the power of the powerless approach of holding them to doing what they say they're going to do. And then the last sort of thought I would leave you with about that sort of, you know, future is here but unevenly distributed is a book I read a few years ago called Victimhood Culture. And the thesis of this book is that, you know, if you go back pre-legal systems, pre-institutions, what you have in many places is an honour culture. So your honour is everything, and if somebody tramples on your honour, you know, the answer is to fight them, to kill them. You know, and we still have a lot of places where honour culture holds. So it holds on the playground, it holds in gangs, certainly holds in prisons. You know, it's the code of the mafia. And honestly, in countries where the legal system is not strong, you're pretty wise to take things in your own hands to the extent you can, because if you don't, no one else will. And then that was replaced by dignity culture. Not completely, but partly. And in dignity culture, it's impressive to have self-control. You know, you turn the other cheek. You show yourself your restraint, and that's actually something that gives you status in that culture. But it relies on institutions, because you have to be able to go to the police and say, you know, he keyed my car, he broke into my house. You know, without the police, you've got to try and do rough justice. And the thesis of the book was that we're now seeing the rise of a new culture, victimhood culture, which is that it's moral and good to be oppressed, to be a victim, and that you get status from that. And there's a lot to be said for that theory, but the point I want to make really is that all three of those things coexist. You know, nothing goes, new things arise, but they don't take over completely. So there's still plenty of places where it isn't impressive to be a victim, but sometimes you're in conversations with people and you think what's impressive is to show self-restraint and to argue politely, but they think what makes them impressive is, you know, floridly acting out their psychosis, you know. I'm sure all of us have been there. But once you understand that that's what it is, that it's two different belief systems and two different moral codes, you know, it just empowers you to think about working in your own code with people who agree with you, calling out what you're seeing. You know, you think it's impressive to act like this, I don't. That sort of thing. I've sort of run out of things in my notes for things to talk about, so I don't think that was a terribly good place to stop. But I suppose I would just repeat the William Gibson point of the future is here, just unevenly distributed. And it's our job to find where there are still redoubts of sanity, bolster them, and use those to push back against the future we don't want to see. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so